Good afternoon and welcome to our Twin Cities Town Hall. We have a greeting from the CEO of Sunrise.
Welcome to the Twin Cities Town Hall, a discussion on racial equity presented to you today by Sunrise Banks and the Forum on Workplace Inclusion. My name is David Reiling. I'm the CEO of Sunrise Banks. It has been 6 months since the death of George Floyd, a tragic event that has sparked a global conversation on race inequality. Today, we have some Twin Cities community leaders with us who will reflect on where we have been as a community and where there is still opportunity for positive change. I would like to introduce our moderator for this town hall event, Roshini Rajkumar. Roshini is a strategic communications coach to C-suite executives. She hosts Real Talk with Roshini on WCCO Radio. She hosts a podcast called Real Leaders. She is a professional speaker, licensed attorney, and former TV reporter. I am pleased to welcome our moderator for today's event, Roshini Rajkumar.
Thank you so much, David, and I am so honored to be the moderator of this special event today. Lots of events have happened in which Minneapolis was really center stage and setting discussions not only around the country, but around the world. So today we are going to talk about some solutions with some amazing Minneapolis-St. Paul leaders whose work really has spanned the country and the globe. Let me introduce you to all of them. Michael Goh is Vice President of Equity and Diversity for the University of Minnesota's 5-campus system. Athena Hollins is Senior Director of Diversity and Foundations for the Minnesota State Bar Association. And congratulations to Athena. She's also representative-elect, will join and get sworn into the Minnesota legislature in January 2021. And Tommy Beavis is has an illustrated background, which he will share with you. He is the Chief Strategy Officer and founder of Pimento Jamaican Kitchens and has so much to share. So what we're going to do is start by giving 90 seconds or so introductions, opening statements from each of our panelists. Tommy, why don't we start with you?
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here, and thanks to Sunrise and everyone for hosting this event. Essentially, a bit about my background is born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, right? And I watched my grandmother, Baby Lou, who had little but an elementary school education, grow to build her empire through selling imported clothing items, food, you name it. But she was also very community-minded. She was an economist, without the training. And so I've seen personally how she's used food to heal community and brought community together. And that's what we're doing at Pimento Jamaican Kitchen. We're creating food. It was created right here in my backyard, and it was created by the community. And the community is who made Pimento who it is. And so it's so interesting that after Mr. Floyd was murdered, we then had the opportunity to work hand in hand with the community and ensuring that we can create lasting change. And by lasting change, we're talking about liberation, economic liberation, political liberation, and social liberation. And that's why we created the B Corporation, Pimento Relief Services. We'll talk a lot more about that soon, I guess.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Athena Hollins, let's hear your opening thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I am really delighted to be here. I guess I always start off my introductions by saying I was born and raised in Hawaii, which is just this bizarre melting pot of Black and brown and indigenous individuals, which really has influenced how I've moved forward in my life. I consider myself I'm a lifelong student of culture and of diversity and how it impacts the world that we live in. And in particular, because I went to law school, I'm very interested and passionate about how it affects the legal profession. Despite the fact that women graduate from law school at higher rates than men do, we know that the profession is still dominated by white men for the most part. And so to me, it's just fascinating to see how we can affect change and create systemic change in legal profession and in the legal culture. And I guess the thing that really matters, why it's so important to me personally, it's not just because I would love to see more people who look like me in the legal profession. It's also because we know that the community at large, communities of color, disadvantaged communities, have less trust in the legal profession when it doesn't look like them, when they do not feel like their stories and their experiences are represented. And so that's really important, because if we don't have the trust of the people in our justice system, we have nothing. So it's a great opportunity to improve what we're doing in the legal profession. And I'm really excited to share with you a little bit of what we've done.
We have such a great mix of panelists today. We have legal, business, definitely corporate social responsibility, which is part of Tommy's past, and academia, and really mental health. And I'd like, Michael Goh, for you to share your opening remarks.
Thank you, Roshini, and it's a pleasure and honor and humbling, I would say, to be joined with Tommy and Athena on this panel. Like Tommy, I'm also an immigrant to this country, very much aware and very quickly learned the social, cultural fabric of this country and the injustices that I experienced, even going through my graduate education at Indiana University and then coming to the University of Minnesota. So this is both a place in which I lived as a student, experienced life, and some of the inequities myself as a student, and now very humbling, as I said, to be in a position as a professor of counseling psychology, of intercultural education, and then to try to do the work as an administrator. Universities and higher education, as you are all aware, are microcosms of diverse people, faculty, staff, students, administrators, spread out over 5 campuses in our case, trying to do this work while also experiencing the tensions, the disagreements, as well as our attempts to find commonalities and community within these tensions. We do this also, it's important to acknowledge, on the homelands of indigenous peoples, the Ojibwe and the Dakota people. So we want to recognize the work and the inequities and the relationships we have to rebuild with our indigenous communities. The university is driven to discover, as we say. We are about enrichment from understanding. We are about dedication to the advancement of learning. We are about seeking truth. We want to share this knowledge for the benefit of our diverse communities, and we want to apply it for the benefit of our peoples. But as we all know, and we have experienced the murder of George Floyd, inequities, injustices remain, and I believe the university should and wants to be and is participating at the center of trying to remedy these injustices. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. In preparing today's questions, I interviewed each of our panelists, and their insight, their expertise went directly into the kinds of questions we'll cover today. We are not going to rehash things you may have seen in the headlines over the last several months. We actually want to give you content that you can implement later today or as early as tomorrow in your organizations, in your communities. And my favorite quote from Athena, the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is not a standalone. It should be in the DNA of every organization. Before that can happen, however, at a systemic level, we have to understand the macro versus the micro. Author Gary Zukav says this: it is the health of the soul that is the true purpose of the human experience. Unlike an animal, humans have an individual soul. You are an individual energy system. You are a micro within the macro. So you have a lot of power individually. I'd like to start with Michael and talk a little bit about that human level, Michael. What do people need to do at the individual micro level to start instituting systemic change?
Wow. I don't want to be evasive, Roshini, but I do want to emphasize that I think it's a both and, meaning it is at the macro and the micro. Because more and more, I think when we talk about institutional racism, when we talk about systemic change, we do believe that the tone from the top, the messaging from the top, the motivation from the top matters. And I think we're learning more and more that leadership creates these opportunities and the culture in which individuals, right, at the micro level are then motivated to want to be open, to be interested, to be educated, which is fundamentally the role of education. And so I think when we talk about humanity or at the human level, I want to believe that the fact that we make education compulsory K-12, P20. If we think broadly, we believe in the potential for human beings to learn, to unlearn, to be educated, to develop views, opinions, ideologies, values. So I hope I'm addressing your question, that I think the macro sets the tone, the macro creates the opportunities. But I do believe, and in my maybe responses to further questions will elaborate on why I personally also do focus a lot of the work on individuals' hearts, minds, being educated and being able to be influenced.
And that's really where it starts. Neuroscientist Terry Wu says that people are influenced by people similar to them. So in order to help make systemic change, we need to individually be influenced by new sources. Athena, please share your thoughts about the micro versus the macro.
That it is one of those things where we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think there are so many things that we can do on an individual level that help create safer spaces and create, greater inclusion in our workplaces or in our communities. But ultimately, I do believe that there are some major systemic inequities that have to be remedied. And really, the problem is you don't know what you don't know. So if it's one thing for me to say, okay, I understand, I've spent years learning this and I have a pretty good idea of where these biases are going to come in. I'm pretty good at checking myself when things like that happen. But to expect everybody in my workplace to be able to do that is really, it's improbable, right? And so when we have that, it's better to have systems in place that prevent people from having those biases rear their ugly heads. That being said, I do have a couple of tips that I always encourage people to take on, especially if this is something they're passionate about and they're just not sure where to start. My first one is I have a buddy system. I have a person who is somebody I trust and somebody who has the same values that I do, who wants to be as inclusive and equitable as possible. And we check each other on all sorts of things. When I make comments that are, not terrible, but probably not the best comments, maybe not as inclusive or not as progressive as I would like to be, they will call me out on them. And I do the same thing. And I think it's important to have those sorts of relationships where you have individuals who will hold you accountable to things that you just don't even notice that you have these biases. So that's one thing that I encourage everybody to do. And it also creates a really strong bond between you and your buddy, because when you can be open and frank like that with somebody, it creates a trust there that I think is important, especially in the workplaces where we tend to just sort of be on a treadmill. The other thing that I will say is when we create systems of increased awareness, we know that people behave better. So there were a bunch of really interesting studies done in sports where we show that when somebody is aware of the fact that they're being closely monitored, or they're aware that that this is something that people believe is happening, then they're less likely to do it. They will check themselves more closely. And so that's something that we can easily do, especially in business places, is make sure that we know that folks at the top are in favor of this, that they want to work on equity and they want the business place to be more inclusive. And so people will start checking themselves to make sure that they're not promoting these sort of, biased or inequitable behaviors and thoughts.
Thank you, Athena. And, I think it is wonderful that you give some real concrete tips that people can use, and also to acknowledge that people are naturally biased. We can't shake bias out, but we can enlighten. And Tommy, I know that you are doing this work every day on the front of macro versus micro, as well as how do we live in our biases, but expand out to bring in more people.
Right. First and foremost, on the macro versus the human level, I think what example I would draw upon is the week after Mr. Floyd was murdered. I was like thinking, oh yes, Pimenta has been that great place where we can bring together all of our friends, whether it's the mayor or whether it's the activists, bring them together and let's have a forum, let's talk about this. And when we were talking to our community members about that, one of the things they're like was, no, hold on. First of all, right now we're hurting. Secondly, we're hungry. And so I personally had to take a step back and understand and see what the community was saying, which is, one, this is not the time for simply running to solve a problem right away. Let's take a minute to heal. And that's where Dr. Joy Lewis would say the revolution will be healing. And so we have to focus on healing and helping each other heal through the process. Then as it relates to the hungry piece, that's where we stepped up and then we created the food distribution efforts. That was as a result of the community effort and the community ran it for themselves. When we talk about these biases, even though the biases exist, we need to, one, know that the discomfort is a part of the process. The pain is a part of the process to get there. And Dr. Joy also talks about how grandma would take the alcohol and clean out one's wound, and the pain would be there. And yet on the other side of the pain is that healing. And so the revolution will be healing. Let us work through it. And I think one of the biggest things that we need to recognize, one of the things that Michael and I would probably call out is the fact that, and Athena called it out, is we had to do the work to understand the social issues we're facing. One of the challenges is people think that Black people were just naturally born to understand the system and the structures and also Black history. I'm a Jamaican, and I'd like to identify myself separately from African Americans because the African Americans have had a unique experience in the pain that has been caused to them, the pain that they've gone through. And so it is important and it is imperative upon us to learn and understand what they've gone through, and also the true history of America as well as the modern world, and until we do that, our biases will always see Black people as those simple people who always need help and can't help themselves. But that's because one hasn't really done the work to understand the Mansa Musas of the world and the universities of Timbuktus of the world, and also when the Moors were ruling Europe, when the Dark Ages were, because it was run by Black people. When we don't know our neighbors, we can then make assumptions about them, and then that's where the assumptions become actions, and then where those actions become very dangerous for all of us.
Well, Tommy, you lead us right into a topic that I got into with Athena during our pre-chat. So I'll let Athena kick it off. Athena taught me about the difference between low context cultures and high context cultures. And what you just sort of gave an anecdote about, a couple anecdotes, Tommy, really fits into this very well, Athena.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, I would like to 100% agree with what Tommy just said. There is an education aspect of this that cannot be overstated. And I think that we've had a lot of discussions in this space about whether it is up to individuals to educate themselves, and I definitely think it is. But ideally, I know I'm going off topic, but ideally this would be something that is taught in schools to our children, because they deserve to know. And the children who are in our schools who are Black and Brown and Indigenous need to know about their history so they can feel powerful too, and know about, how successful we were in different contexts. So sorry, that's going off on a tangent. But to answer your question, yeah, high and low context communication styles are so important. And like I said, I'm a lifelong student of culture. Coming from Hawaii, where my high school was 70% Japanese, we have a very different way of communicating than when I moved to Minnesota and experienced communication here. In general, Western cultures tend to be more low context communication, and that means that there's an understanding that whatever is said is exactly what's meant, as opposed to high context communication cultures, where it's about what kind of eye contact you're making, how you say it, what gestures you're using, just everything around the words that you're saying impact what you actually mean. And I preach this to individuals because I think it is so important for us to understand those differences when we are working with diverse folks, that everybody comes from these different backgrounds. And really, truly, you're influenced by where you grew up, where you had these sort of formidable experiences. So even though I am Black, I'm Black and white mixed, my experiences growing up were in a predominantly Asian culture. And so I have taken on a lot of those communication styles where, which, clash in a lot of ways with the more direct communication styles of the majority culture here in the United States, in the continental United States. So I do try to educate individuals on this so that they can have those conversations in a more meaningful way and understand that sometimes it requires more questions, more listening, and maybe a deeper understanding of a person's background and cultural aspects than we normally give credit for. A lot of times in America, we will say, if you do not conform to what the majority says is the right way to communicate or to express yourself, then you're just out of luck. And I think that's a totally backwards way of doing things. And we absolutely need to be more respectful and more considerate about this if we want to benefit from the diversity that we're bringing in, and if we want to make it a more welcoming place. So I don't know if that gets at your question, Roshini.
You got it. That question and so many more, Athena. And you are like a petri dish with your background of all these different cultures. You're your own melting pot. I will once again quote neuroscientist Terry Wu, who says, when we think fast, we tend to introduce biases. So if we were to just slow down in considering an individual or a group of people, the example that he shared is write a short essay about them. And in those studies, they've found those short essays actually deliver more meaning and fewer biases. Michael, you talk about leading and the tone from the top. I know that's of importance to you at the University of Minnesota. You're guiding those efforts. What is your advice for institutional diversity for all the organizations who are represented on our town hall today?
Thank you, and I apologize in advance because like Athena and Tommy, we're just trying to reinforce and affirm some of the things that you said, and I want to just affirm how important what Athena said about starting educating some of these principles. It is in the academy that we no longer question whether biases happen, right? And it's an assumption. It comes across so easily. It's been lived out in our recent electoral history, even in the United States here right now, that one should assume cultural complexities in any and every interaction. And it does not come naturally. So it has to be trained. And if I can connect that to the fact that I think for that reason, frankly, search committees for C-suite, for executive, for leadership positions in any institutions have been more, have been wiser and more intentional in understanding the importance of these racial, cultural, social justice understandings and expertise and talents to know how to navigate and negotiate these complexities towards the goal of racial equity for any institution. So I think it starts with how we search for leaders, what qualifications, what preferences, how we create search committees, if I can be practical, in how we find some of these leadership individuals. I have been blessed, I think, at the University of Minnesota with our current transition of a new president, of a new chief academic officer, and other leadership positions, that we have sought these individuals, that we have found these individuals who value. And I think it starts, that's why, with individuals who can articulate it in their position statements and their philosophies, and not just with words, but with experience, with a track record, with examples concretely that they have tried to address. It doesn't mean, and I think my leadership at the University of Minnesota will claim, nothing prepared us for what ensued in the last 10 months that we have all experienced as a nation. But I think when we can find leadership that is not based on programs and activities that they have created in the past, but that is grounded on principles of what is institutionally anti-racist, what is fundamentally racial equity, what does it mean to pursue social justice in our research, our teaching, and our service engagement. That has to permeate and start at the leadership level. Roshini.
Thank you, Michael. You talk about institutional diversity. We're going to get into interactional diversity in a moment. But before we do that, another favorite phrase that came out of my pre-chats with our Rockstar panelists is that of Tommy Beavis's, where he says, everybody is an instrument of liberation. Not only do I love listening to the sound of his voice say that, Tommy, what does that mean?
I'll respond within the context of how Michael was speaking, right? Let's take a step back, and there's a new show on Apple TV called Bankers. And in that show, it shows two black men who were trying to run banks and open banks in the 50s, 60s time frame. And at that time, it was literally illegal for them to not only own banks, but for them to even be banking at these banks. And so it's a fascinating show. And so I say that to say we need to recognize that a lot of our systems have been intentionally and systematically designed to lock a lot of people out, right? And so when you talk about the view from the top, what we need to recognize is we have the opportunity now to not only open the doors, but take those doors off their hinges. I would challenge people in leadership to ask themselves, how many people like myself, like yourself, or like oneself, have you promoted? Have you helped groom? You're like, oh, I see myself in that young woman, or I see myself in that young man, and help them. And then the question is, how many of them have been people of color? I would say if based on the number of, let's say, white people have mentored or helped or opened doors or are connected, and you're thinking back in your head as, oh yeah, this person and that person. Now multiply that number by 3 or 4 or 10 and find some black people and people of color, BIPOC community, who you can also help get there, help open the door. This is about taking action. And we talk about liberation. That's what we're talking about. You are an instrument of liberation, right? Regardless of the role you're in. If you're in banking, you have the opportunity to help take the doors off the hinges to make it a free flow, and so our economy can continue to grow. If you're in puppet making, literally yesterday I was on a call and there's a puppet maker there, and I'm like, yes, imagine how even as a puppeteer, you can be out there being an instrument of liberation by educating, using your little puppets to educate the next generation on issues that they need to understand in a more meaningful, bite-sized manner. As instruments of liberation, we talk about economic liberation, right? So how do we create opportunities for black people to start their businesses? When we talk about social liberation, we talk about that healing component. We talk about that academic component. So how do we help rewrite that history or her story to where we can get it accurate, so we don't do a disservice to humanity by giving misinformation and intentionally wrong information to future generations. And then we talk about political liberation. It's how do we get more people to either get out the vote, get active in their community, letter writing efforts, but also how do we get people to run for office themselves and hold office for themselves. And then the other portion of it is how do we even create a political action committee or find ways to support those candidates. And we're talking about candidates of all shades, as long as they're supporting the issues that are important to getting us to the next level as we grow and create a more perfect union. And so when we talk about instruments of liberation, no matter who you are, no matter where you're sitting, remember that your predecessors intentionally locked the doors. Now you have the opportunity to open the doors, take those doors off the hinges, and welcome others in so we can all continue to grow together.
Tommy, I love that, because you're really calling to action people to take this as a personal responsibility, because it really does start with each individual. We have many questions coming into the chat. We will try to get to as many of them as we can. And I'll just say, for ease of reading, the tighter your question, the more likely I'll be able to read it carefully and get to it. On this note, though, Tommy, because in your past, you worked at the United States Chamber of Commerce. You also did corporate social responsibility for Cargill. These are very precious topics for you. Ryan Murphy asks this. So I'm going to start with you, Tommy, on this one. He says, Are payday loans and check cashing places a big problem? Would you want to be part of a push for reintroduction of postal banking to help that? I don't know what postal banking is, but the whole payday loans issue, and I know loaning and money is a pet topic for you.
Right. If I were to talk about, I think by postal banking, they're referring to back in the days when post offices could actually literally serve as banks. And in Jamaica, we literally have post offices that serve as banks for communities where there are no banks. You remember that when people are doing community planning, they usually think of the banks, the places of worship, and the school, and probably a post office. But oftentimes what we see is that in communities of color, we don't have set infrastructure. But then we have to remember that that is also intentional, right? Because there are deeds right here in Minneapolis that say, thou shalt not sell to a Black person. There's redlining that was intentionally created, right? And so a lot of people who have wealth today have wealth because of inheritance, have wealth because of land that has been passed down to them, whether it's farmland or city land. And yet we know that a lot of people of color have been locked out of even getting access to land. We don't even get access to capital. And I'll say this, thank you, Sunrise. Sunrise was one of the first banks, was the first bank to step up and help Memento get a loan to build out into our physical spaces. And it actually came as a result of us partnering with MCCD and folks like NIDA. And so oftentimes what you see is even access to capital is hard when you have a thriving business with results, when you have your own assets and property, when you even have good credit and money in the bank and all the right systems in place. It is still virtually impossible for people of color to get access to loans or capital. And we're not even talking about even the payday loans. We're talking about those who on paper meets the requirements, right? And so we need to even provide to offset that system, take a wrecking ball to that system. Because even when we think of even the concept of credit, when we think of credit, it's interesting that we use credit to figure out who gets loans, and yet we know that credit was intended to be not just discriminatory, but more so it is also, I'm saying you don't have credit, but I'm not giving you credit through loans. And so it's kind of weird that you're saying you have to demonstrate good credit, but I'm not giving you the loans to demonstrate good credit. And that's the system that we're using to base how we treat individuals in society. And then I guess the final point on that too is that we just have to reconcile within ourselves, like, if not now, when are we going to really make this a better place, not just for people of color, but we have to liberate the entire population. We have to liberate everybody to where we can also have that economic liberation where we can all continue to grow. You cannot lock out such a large population of society, which usually over-indexes on every consumer report, and expect for the economy to continue to grow. So imagine where we can go as a country, as an economy, as humanity, if we can just liberate ourselves.
Tommy, so well said. And on that note of banking, I remember when I was getting my first business credit card after I left television news to launch my consulting and executive coaching practice, getting that first business credit card from my banker at US Bank and being given a line of credit was such an emotional day. You feel like there's confidence. You feel like someone is saying you can go out and do. And that is a very personal, emotional thing. We have a lot of questions coming in. Catherine Essenberg asks this, and I'm going to address it to Athena. How can you, quote, force a company to change their practices and company cultures when the C-suite leaders don't care to address or work toward true equality?
Yeah, that's a really fair question. And I guess my answer would be, you can't. I mean, it's really difficult to force a company's hand to do something when they just absolutely refuse to do anything, especially from the C-suite. You really have to have leadership at the top emphasizing that it's something that's important to them. I think that what you can do is make a case for why it should be important and why there should be a focus on it. And there's certainly a lot of documentation about business cases and how it's best for business practices. Also, you know, what it means for retaining retaining folks. Like there's money to be made, right, in being more inclusive, more equitable. It is a good business practice in general. But that being said, I think that for real change to happen, you have to have buy-in from leadership, especially depending on how hierarchical your company is. I know that's not probably the answer that you want to hear, and there's certainly small changes that you can implement on your own. You can certainly reach out to human resources to encourage some of those small changes that can be made. But it is truly my belief that you have to have leadership who is willing to be open to change, taking risks, and frankly, being empathetic to make some of these real changes. One of the things that I ask leaders when I'm working with them is to think about a time when they felt excluded or disenfranchised in some way, because I think a lot of times folks don't realize that this is the way that we've made other groups feel systemically, right? Like this is something that we have done very purposefully to disenfranchise individuals, and we have to reverse that. And sometimes it takes like getting in touch with how it felt to be made, to feel less than, for folks to understand why it's so important for us to move forward.
Athena, I'm going to follow up with Jesse Gabor's question, and your law is so important to you, and you are a lawyer. What is, quote, true equity, and what metric should be used to quantify this?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that somebody asked this question, because that was one of the things that I wanted to bring up, since this is, this is titled racial equity, and I want to make sure that we're really thinking about what that means when we talk about racial equity. And I think Tommy hit on it a little bit, maybe a lot, that there's been laws and practices in place for generations that have systematically denied people the right to have certain things, to belong to certain groups, to engage in ways that make money, that are useful. I mean, just everything, right? I mean, it's not an accident that there's such a disparity in home ownership with Black and Brown communities. That's not accidental. That is 100% on purpose. And you can follow this path down almost any way you want to. I mean, police interactions, it's not an accident. There's more police that are sent to Black and Brown communities than there are to white communities. We know that a lot of these crimes are proportionally done exactly in the same amount. We know that marijuana smoking happens in the same rates in white communities as it is in Black communities. But go ahead and look in the jails and see who's in there, because it is not your frat boys who are clearly smoking weed. It is people in other communities where they are being over-policed. So when we talk about equity, I don't think that we can say that there's just one way to do equity. It has to impact every single aspect of our cultures and communities. And I know that's a hard ask. Like, I recognize that saying that is intimidating and slightly exhausting. But I think it's important, because there is this notion that if we just do this one thing, then everything will be all right. And that's inaccurate. I mean, right now we're talking a lot about, the Black and African American community, but, we can talk about equity in the indigenous communities and what that looks like. We can talk about in the Chinese community that were, not allowed to, marry outside of their race because they didn't want wealth from white communities going into Chinese families. Like, there has been rules and laws in place that we've taken out for the most part, but now we have to do things to correct for those inequities. And that's the real difference. It's not just stopping the bad practice. It's how do we make somebody whole after generations of these bad things have happened. And it's going to look different for each different community and how people have been impacted. But I think a great start is trying to correct, seeing those where we have disparities, trying to figure out ways to correct those disparities. If that means that we give out more home loans to communities of color, that is absolutely worth it. in my mind. If that means that we are looking at reducing policing in certain areas or trying to figure out alternatives to policing, I think that is something that is very necessary. So it's a whole host of things that we have to do to reach this pinnacle ideal of equity. And I would not want to say that this is the one simple trick to get to equity. There's no such thing.
Absolutely. These issues are dynamic and deep and involve all of us to find the solutions. And that's why we have these amazing panelists today to talk about solutions, to give you ideas to implement in your worlds. We've received several questions about whether today's town hall is being recorded. And yes, it is. Great news. You can rewatch it. You can share it with your friends, family, colleagues, everyone in your circles. Michael, I will go to you for our next question from David Milton. Financial literacy is a multi-generational discipline. Should higher education lead the way to fill in the gap, or should it be left up to banks and community activists?
Thank you for the question. I think it starts even before higher education. And continuing the conversation about equity, it's unfortunate that we live in a state where not just health disparities, but the educational disparities is glaring in Minneapolis in particular. And for that reason, I think equitable access to higher education is key for all the universities in Minnesota, but we take our role as a land-grant university, public university, seriously in trying to connect better, do better programming with college readiness, reaching out to middle school students, and giving opportunities not just to visit campus, but to interact with faculty and to show that to build that genuine rapport and trust from young. But it includes not just academic preparation, to your question, Roshini. We believe that kids at that age, parents at that age, and considering college education, should know the full slate of financial resources, grants, scholarships available to avoid debt. And that is possible. And I'm glad that the university is also looking at further ways to make education more accessible for our communities. In addition to, I think, financial literacy that we have suggested happen in preparation to apply to colleges is the ways we look at the lack of educational opportunities and how some of our gatekeeping criteria may be disadvantaging some populations more than others. So our admissions teams works really hard to not just reach out to, but I think educate our so-called admissions gatekeepers at every level, right? Unit, program, college, as a university, how we can allow a more diverse representation on our campuses. But financial literacy is also we've also heard from our employers, in addition to financial literacy, career literacy and career success. And within the preparation of higher education, how does one look forward to one's employment years in addressing debt and loans that might have been accumulated? But I will add, beyond financial literacy, I think we're learning, and we have learned, about addressing racial microaggressions, climate issues that unfortunately continue beyond higher education into the workplace, and how partnering both with employers but preparing our students to know how to be successful in these environments are programs that will be helpful.
And I'll give an unsolicited shout out then to one of our sponsors today. Sunrise Banks has lots of information to help you with financial literacy. Check out their website, call one of their bankers. I'm sure they would love to help. A great question from Vince Terrien. What are some of the most common things that reduce racial equity within companies and organizations? What are some ways they can be addressed? And I know, Tommy, you have a lot of expertise on corporate social responsibility, and you are a business owner yourself. You dealt with some destruction during the events of the summer. I think you're just the guy to answer this question.
That's a very good question. And I think it goes back to some of what Athena was talking about earlier. I think first and foremost, I would say from an equity standpoint, we have to recognize that until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, we completely need to change how we approach each other, is step one. Step two, the education part of it, right? So we didn't even know, if we don't know, then we will always have those biases unchecked. And so I think step one is getting to know those who are next to you, your community, those who you're working with. Then there's also, as it relates to the business case, when you talk about breaking down those racial issues, let's go ahead and make a business case for it. America is becoming browner and browner by the day. And if your company is not ready, you're going to be in trouble. It is negligent for you as a corporate leader right now to not address this, knowing that America is only going to become browner and browner. And when we talk about corporate responsibility, we need to take it another level. So no longer should we provide $1 million to this theater where the CEO and his wife, because that's usually how it is, are going to go enjoy this theater. So we'll give them $1 million so we can put our name on that stage. Meanwhile, an equivalent theater where there's great local art and talent, we're given $10,000. So we, from a CSR standpoint, we need to ensure that when we're investing and not just doing press release impact making. And so by us helping to make the business case, we will help the C-suite understand the importance of addressing these issues, because if not now, when? It's already too late, because people are already surprised by a notion of Juneteenth, which is something I discovered many years ago when I came to the US. And I'm like thinking, if people are still being surprised by these things, it means that we really don't know each other as neighbors or as fellow Americans. And until we address those issues, we'll continue to have issues. And that's why it's important. And I call on like even the University of Minnesota to finally help have conversations around truth and reconciliations, so we can understand truly who we are as a nation. That's where we can even have the conversation about cultural reparation. And we're not talking about, oh, let's give them money for this or that, even though that was already done to the slave masters, you know. But nonetheless, I'm talking about cultural reparation to figure out how do we rewrite our story together as humanity.
Thank you, Tommy. And I want to be very respectful of everyone's time today. To reiterate, this program is being recorded. You will receive an email from Sunrise Banks and the Forum on Workplace Inclusion, thanking you for being with us today. And we know that many of your colleagues couldn't join you due to all the things that are happening right now. Please share this recording with them after you receive the link. We've also had, to last count, nearly 40 questions in the chat. I applaud the nearly 800 of you who registered to be with us today, and all of you who were brave enough to ask a question. Sincere apologies for not being able to get to every question, but these three panelists are public figures. Look them up, write them directly. And sorry, guys, I needed to put that out there. Hopefully your inboxes won't be too inundated, but as you can see, there were amazing practitioners in this work. They're doing it every day. We're getting lots of messages thanking people for the thoughtfulness of all of you. To that end, I want us to start winding down. We still have some more content for you all, but let's wind down with some final thoughts from each of you, and maybe in the form of a really strong tip. And I always like to add a fun fact, so you know these brainiacs also have personalities and a lot of fun and refresh time in their lives. We'll start with Athena, and my favorite fun fact about her is that she's teaching her 7-year-old how to play poker.
Yes, it's true. She has a terrible poker face, but it's been pretty fun and rewarding during the pandemic to really get into some card playing. So now she can do poker, blackjack. She's got a number of skills under her belt. So, we're looking to the future. I guess for my one concrete skill or tip that I would give to folks is to really be purposeful about what you're doing. And I want people to think through what it is they want to get out of something, like what their goal is. And it doesn't have to be everything, right? Like, that's my concern, is that folks are going to look at this and say, if I can't get to total equity, I'm not going to do anything. This is too stressful. I can't deal with it. No, choose something focus on it, create a plan, and execute that plan. And what I tell folks all the time is that if it doesn't work out, if you don't see the results that you want to, that's okay. You can try again. This isn't a test. This isn't a situation where you're in trouble because it didn't work out. I want folks to take risks on this topic. I want them to try new things, because we clearly don't have all the answers, but we need everybody thinking about this in order to get to where we want to be. So that's my number one takeaway. I do have some documents that we have that are public on the MSBA website, especially the nudge sheet, which we have created, and we have people look at it before they do interviews. So it's really just to nudge people in the right direction when they're doing interviews, to remind them about implicit biases that they might hold, and hopefully help them remember those biases when they're in that interview, so that they don't make those sorts of snap judgments about people. And one thing that I like to do when I do trainings is I always admit some biases that I have or mistakes that I've made, because I think it's important to acknowledge that none of us are perfect, and that we all need reminders. So one of the ones that I have on my personal nudge sheet that I've edited for myself is a reminder that just because a woman has a high voice doesn't mean that she is not qualified. I have noticed that I have a bias when somebody has a higher voice, and I have no idea why that is, but I know that that's something that I tend to think negative thoughts about. And so it's a reminder to me that that's not the case, and that you need to make a decision based on the facts that are in front of you and not based on your weird biases. So that would be my advice, is just being, keep chugging along and make concrete plans on what you want to do and just try to execute on them. It's not rocket science, unfortunately.
Thank you, Athena. For final thoughts, we'll go to Michael. A favorite quote of mine that Michael shared with me: millions of microorganisms within nature somehow find a way to thrive. And I think that speaks volumes about who you are, and that you noticed that, Michael. What are your final thoughts for us today?
Thank you. And that thought actually has to be credited to one of my mentors, Professor Sun Ang, who talks about cultural intelligence, because she looks at biodiversity as a way that microcosms and biodiversity has found a way to coexist in a way that humankind has found extremely difficult. I want us to, I think, focus back on where we started, which is on people. And remembering that the harsh ways this nation in particular has interacted with each other, the last 4 years in particular, we can definitely do better. And when it comes to people, and maybe connecting it to the earlier question of our inability to force C-suites that are resistant, I just want to invite anybody that's resistant to just take 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, 15, and you'll find that an hour passes really quickly, to listen. Listen actively, listen with intention to people, your employees, your staff, your coworkers, because when we do that, you will hear stories that are just so poignant, that are so filled with so much hurt. And I hope our human nature then feels compelled. So the practical thing I recommend actually is several. It's about cultural empathy. And I know that doesn't come easily. How do we develop an interest in others? Truly interested, without judgment, without prejudice, so that we believe that together we can build a better community that we all live in. I will end by saying I've been fortunate, I think, in my counseling and my teacher education experiences to have had thousands of individuals. I've had the opportunity to offer lenses for which they can be successful as counselors, where they can work effectively with diverse classrooms, where they can help every child see the opportunities, the educational successes that is possible. And I share that because it has been full of challenges. When you see the raw biases, unconscious and conscious, that show up, but I've also experienced the hope in lives and minds and hearts that have changed, so that it actually shows up in the actions and the behaviors of people that I believe will contribute to what this panel is about, racial equity.
Tommy, a wonderful thing about your family is you and your wife named your now 4-year-old Genesis. That says a lot. Really quickly, some final thoughts from you.
Yes, real quickly, yes. I would call on everybody again to know that you are an instrument of liberation. Your predecessors in your seat created a lot of barriers. Now it is your turn to kick those down. When we talk about when we lift up a woman, we lift up a village. When we lift up the African Americans and the work that they've done to build this country is when we lift up this nation. We have no excuses anymore. The revolution will not be televised. The world is changing, and it is up to us to create that change. We have the resources, we have the know-how, we have the willpower to make this the best opportunity for humanity to be an instrument of liberation. One love.
One love. And I want to thank all of our fabulous panelists today. Reach out to them separately. This recording will be sent to you along with some other materials. So thank you for signing up. Please share the materials, the link with your colleagues, your friends, your family. That neighbor down the street who just doesn't get you, send them this link. Life is as simple or as difficult as we make it. And certainly these are complex topics, but we call you to action to be the best micro in our macro human existence. Thank you.